Hello and welcome to the big picture. The dispute over the control of the South China Sea took a decisive turn today with the Permanent Court of Arbitration at Hague declaring that China cannot claim any historic rights to islands in the sea. The tribunal also ruled that China has violated Philippines' sovereign rights. The dispute had been raised by Philippines in 2013. However, China had refused to participate in the tribunal proceedings, questioning its jurisdiction among other things. Today, after the tribunal announced its verdict, China has officially announced that it was neither accepting nor recognizing the award of the tribunal. This award had been looked forward to by many countries, including India and United States, both of which have strategic maritime as well as economic interests in the region. However, China has been claiming that it has historic control of over 85% of the South China Sea, while countries like Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan and Brunei also have been making competing claims. Today we will look at the decision of the Hague Tribunal and also what it means, what will be its fallout, especially after China has rejected the decision. To discuss this, I have with me Rajiv Sikri, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Srikanth Kondapalli, Professor in Chinese Studies at the JNU, Commodore retired C.Uday Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies, and on the phone line from Beijing is Atul Aneja, Associate Editor of The Hindu. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Sikri, if you have to summarize what this dispute was, what was the essentially what was the dispute?
This dispute is about whether China has historic rights and what is the source of the maritime entitlements of China. It was not about deciding the territorial dispute.
Right.
But to consider this aspect, that the court has made very clear. And the fact that China did not participate in it and rejected it from the beginning, their arguments, in my view, have no weight because the Permanent Court of Arbitration rules themselves say that in case a party does not accept jurisdiction, you can still go ahead with that. However, the PCA will take special care to ensure that the claims are well founded, and for that they did close questioning of the Philippines. They looked at written submissions before and after. They relied on the views of independent experts, and they went into historical records and so forth. And whether or not the PCA has jurisdiction, the final decision is that of the court itself. So all these Chinese arguments do not carry much water. The fact remains that the Chinese anticipated that the award would go against them, which is why for more than a year now they have been talking about it. So there was actually in October last year an award on jurisdiction and admissibility.
Right.
And now this is the final award and there is no appeal. So this is final and binding. Though there is no provision to actually enforce it, and it is expected that the parties will accept it. But China, as you have mentioned, has rejected it. Now what will happen further is something that we will have to
we'll discuss that. Srikanth, does China has any case when it says that when it questions the jurisdiction of the tribe?
Well, China joined the UNCLOS before, and so
UNCLOS is United Nations Convention of Law to the Sea.
Yeah,
of the law of the sea.
So it is it has accepted the maritime order as defined by the UNCLOS or other from the 1940s. In 1956, they accepted the cannon fire rule, which is the 12 nautical mile limit exclusive military zone, and the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone for fisheries, minerals, energy, and so on and so forth. So in a way, willy-nilly, they have accepted some of these. Although the current discourse is that all these rules were prepared by someone else, that China was not a party to the rule making, and hence China has some hesitation in fully following the UNCLOS provisions in terms of the so they have
But
suggested.
they are a signatory to it.
That's right. So, in other words, they have before, since the 1980s and 90s, they have accepted this, and even before, from the 1950s on, 40s and 50s on, they have accepted willy-nilly the maritime order, the maritime commons, and so on and so forth. But the issue here is the South China Sea, the nine dash line, and the 90% of the South China Sea, 3.5 million square kilometers territory. The Chinese proposal is that this is a territorial sea, which means that freedom of navigation would be problematic. Although they clarified that they are not obstructing the freedom of navigation, that they have not obstructed before. Although we have had some experience with the INS Airawat incident and the USS Impeccable and other for the Americans. But the concept for the Chinese is the territorial sea, which means that the international waters will be a problematic in South China Sea. So the Hague Court ruling also suggests that these are international waters.
Right.
So in other words, they punctured the Chinese argument on that aspect. So to that extent, I think the maritime commons have been reiterated in the current judgment.
Okay. Uday? So now that this award, as Mr. Sikri pointed out, it can't be enforced if they have rejected it. So what happens?
Well, you're right. I think, as far as the arbitration award or the decision itself is concerned, it's fairly explicit that the Chinese assertion based on the historical claim has been rejected. I think more than the decision itself or the verdict, what is going to be very instructive is how China will respond. Because as we rightly pointed out, this particular body, the PCA, does not have any enforcement mechanism. Much of it is left to the rectitude of the parties concerned. And here, I think since China is deemed to be a major power, this is going to be a litmus about what I would call as the global order, meaning that at one level, it transcends the maritime order. As Srikanth pointed out, China had become a signatory to the 1982 UNCLOS in 1996 when they ratified it. So thereby, in good faith, as part of the international community, you accept the norms that go along with the UNCLOS. Now, UNCLOS has made it very clear that if you have the equivalent of man-made islands, which is what is at dispute here, you do not have a maritime entitlement. So the suggestion that you have created these so-called structures and then you start drawing lines, 200 and more. And there is a claim which says that, China's territorial waters, as has been explained, goes almost up to 2,000 kilometers, which is quite, as I said, untenable. So I think what is going to be very instructive is how will China respond to the PCA? And I think they have also been, in a way, alerted, or it has been mentioned. India and Bangladesh had arrived at the equivalent of a modus vivendi, again over a fairly complex maritime delimitation issue. Now, I don't think China wants to hear this at this point in time, but the test case is how do major powers deal with fairly intractable territorial and related disputes? And I think that's going to be instructive not only for the ASEAN countries, but China, Japan. They are now at loggerheads in the East Sea. India and China, as far as the territorial dispute, as also the principle of freedom of navigation at sea. Because I think Srikanth has rightly pointed out, you do not want the equivalent of China's territorial claim being, in a way, accepted. And other countries that then want to navigate will have to, quote unquote, inform or get a kind of concurrence. And we've had our own experience about this issue. So I think the Chinese response is going to be very critical. And the first signs of the Foreign Office statement from Beijing are very categorical. They've used null and void, which is a very strong turn of phrase.
Very, very categorical statement they've made. Atul?
Yeah.
Atul, how do you look at this decision of the tribunal and the reaction of the Chinese government?
Well, frankly, Girish, I am no expert on international law, and so really I can't really comment on that. I would go by the judgment of your other panelists over here. But what I can say is the response which is coming out and the mood in Beijing right now. Now, what has happened here is that it's in three forms. You know, you've seen the foreign ministry statement, which is very, very hard line and sticking to their guns and reiterating their earlier positions. So no flexibility there. But if you see the debate which is going on television here among the experts and even off the record with the officials in the foreign ministry, there are two moods. One is, of course, within the military, which is a hardline mood that that we take offense to this and we pursue the live firing drills were held in South China Sea. So we have a more assertive posture. That is coming from one section. But quite frankly, this is a mature and a very pragmatic nation. The dominant view, which I can guess over here, is that despite what positions you take officially, it is time to talk. And the time is to talk quietly behind closed doors with all the principles. For example, in the case of Philippines, the statement makes a distinction about the Aquino government and the one which has now come. And in fact, praising one of the foreign ministries, not foreign ministry, but there was an illusion in one of the official circles that the offer from the Philippines to share the territorial sea rather before we can come to a final territorial maritime delimitation was welcomed over here. So they see a sort of a departure from the earlier phase to now. So there is pragmatism which is coming over here. I think ultimately this is what is going to happen. But finally, this is not so much about legality. What the Chinese are really saying is that this is basically a question of geopolitics, and this is the control of Asia Pacific. The time has come to challenge the U.S. dominance and being the principal hegemon in the Asia Pacific. And I think that is something that friction will go on despite all the dialogue which is going on, because for the Chinese, what is cast in stone is that the unipolar era is over and it is a multipolar world, and that South China Sea is becoming a test case for the assertion of new players on the global stage, and they themselves count themselves as preeminent among them.
Okay, that's very interesting, Mr. Sikri.
Yeah.
So, it is a geopolitics. And where does India come in all this? And how do we react to this?
Well, I think the Indian statement, and I've just seen it, is very cautious, very brief. We have noted the award and we are studying it carefully. But in the past, I think our senior spokespersons have made the following points. One, that we have not taken a view on the territorial claims. We have focused on freedom of navigation and overflight, the need to observe international law, including UNCLOS, that there should be dispute settlement by peaceful means, all sides should exercise self-restraint, and there should be a full and effective implementation of a code of conduct that should be developed on the basis of the declaration of the code of conduct, but on the basis of consensus. So, these are the elements. Now, from our perspective, I think the freedom of navigation and overflights is critical for two reasons. One, that a lot of our trade passes through the South China Sea. Therefore, as has been pointed out, we cannot accept a situation where we are dependent on the goodwill of the Chinese for transit. And I think that the South China Sea has the same kind of importance that, say, the Suez Canal or the Malacca Straits or the Bosphorus Straits have. And when disputes arose, there was a thing. The second, that if China manages to establish its sovereignty over these islands and the waters, then it becomes a very important base for its power projection in the Indian Ocean. And that is something about which we are understandably very concerned. So therefore, I don't think that India will be passive, and I think that all the steps that we have taken, whether with the USA or Japan, bilaterally, trilaterally, with Australia and Vietnam and so forth, is intended to create a coalition of forces that hopefully would signal to China that please do not go beyond a point, because if you do, then serious national interests are involved and there will be a counter to that.
Srikanth, do you agree with that? And then, India was slightly aggressive in the past when it issued statements with Japan, with US. But in the last few months, last month when the PM was in US, there was some kind of a toning down on this issue. Did not mention South China Sea, spoke of maritime. So, how do you think India should react now?
I think as we are talking, there is from May for 2 months, that is till this month, there are 4 Indian naval vessels which are actually in the South China Sea and contiguous region. One conducting the Malabar exercises with the United States and Japan. Second, doing port calls at Cameron Bay, at Busan in South Korea, in Malaysia, in Sasebo in Japan. So in other words, in terms of the military presence, India had signaled that it has some role here, although it has not accepted the joint patrolling with the United States. So from that point of view, I think it still has a certain role to play with the ASEAN countries. Although we are also doing search and rescue operations with the Chinese Navy in Cochin and other places. So I think we are playing a balanced role in that region. But I should say that the former Defense Minister Anthony had clarified that this is a bilateral dispute and we are not a party to the dispute. We are not taking sides to between the contestants in this dispute. So I think the Indian position has been, as clarified by Ambassador Sikri, I think had all those elements. I would also say that we have a couple of years ago in our joint statement with the Philippines, we stated this region is part of the West Philippine Sea. We did not mention South China Sea. So in other words, we are building up.
We have renamed the
which is what the locals call and the Filipinos call. So I think
Chinese don't accept it.
Chinese call this as South China Sea. By the way, they are also trying to rename the Indian Ocean by some other name. So I think these are all part of that contestation of different names. So I think the Indian position is kind of balanced with the options open, both with China and with the other countries as well.
Uday, this balancing, how far, will it be successful?
Girish, if you allow me, I just want to back up a little bit. You suggested that perhaps India's position on the South China Sea over the last couple of years has been more aggressive.
Yes.
I'd like to qualify that and say perhaps actually it's been more definitive. It's not been aggressive because I think we have proceeded fairly cautiously.
But there have been certain commentators saying that.
I agree with that. Yeah. I'm only saying definitive for this reason, saying that aggressive has a different connotation. Whereas you see that India is becoming more definitive starting with the visit of President Obama.
Yeah.
When for the first time in the joint statement, there is a specific reference to the South China Sea. And then, as Srikanth said, we have, with different bilaterals, made our point that we uphold the principle of freedom of navigation, respect for international law and customary practice. And I think these are important elements. So at this stage, when we talk about the geopolitical dimension, I think India should continue this particular orientation where we have evinced and displayed our interest because some principles are involved. And along with that, I think at this stage, if we talk about the geopolitical template, clearly China is convinced that the United States has set up everybody. So much so, if you look at the editorials in some of their newspapers that are closely affiliated with both party and government, the hardliners, as Atul pointed out from Beijing, are actually growling. They are saying that we will go to any step, quote unquote, to defend sovereignty. Now, I think the role that perhaps India could play while we are awaiting Beijing's response is perhaps to engage in some quiet chat with the Chinese. Of course, there is a post-NSG context, but to remind them that we dealt with the Bangladesh issue in a certain manner and that there is a case for the principles that we are not, I think he pointed out, and this is the Indian position, we are taking no position on the territoriality, but we are talking about the way in which maritime practice and law must be respected because that has a bearing, as I said, on the larger issue of the global order, which is why I think perhaps India could consider, in a way, dealing with each of the major stakeholders in its own way, as it has in the past, and reiterating these points.
Separately and bilaterally.
Yeah, and saying that, by negotiation, we can find a modus vivendi, which is what one school in Beijing seems to suggest. Even the Philippines government, now that there is a change of government, are actually talking about some kind of an accommodation. I think some, as I said, slivers there.
Atul says that, China is a practical nation. We're joined by Manoj Joshi. Manoj Joshi is a senior journalist. Manoj, how do you look at this? You think that in the context of which this tribunal order has come and the way the Chinese reacted, but Atul is with us in Beijing. He feels that maybe, despite all the aggression being showed by certain sections in China, they may come around to talking. And where does it begin? This dialogue or discussions, if it has to begin?
I can't hear you clearly on that.
Yeah, how do you react to this and how do you think the Chinese will take this forward?
Oh, okay. Well, I think, one of the most important things is that the process of bringing China into the world community began in 1971 when the People's Republic got the seat of the Republic of China and they became members of the UN Security Council. Then they became members of NPT, UNCLOS, WTO. Now, when you have something like UNCLOS and the way China is challenging it, they're basically undermining the very basis of that agreement by saying that this dispute cannot be heard by the arbitration tribunal. I think it's will create huge reputational damage to China. I think China will, there is no doubt that China is militarily in a good position in South China Sea and they can dominate the South China Sea. But the reputational damage, because, if you look at Philippines and Vietnam, from now on, they will have the power of this tribunal verdict to say, well, they will show that to China. And in turn, all that China is saying is, the hell with you, we don't care about international tribunals. If they don't support us, and we can cherry pick international law. Now that is the big danger, because what happens is that arbitration is not something that only happens in UNCLOS. Arbitration is there for every international agreement, meaning if Chinese companies go out to build a railroad, there's an arbitration clause in that agreement. And people are soon going to say that, look, these Chinese are strange guys, meaning if the arbitration goes against them, they say they're not going to accept it. So I think this long-term reputational damage to China, I think will be fairly severe. And after saying that, what I'd like to say is that I think this is an opportunity for the world community and particularly the United States, because there's a parallel problem that the United States and China have with regard to the interpretation of UNCLOS, the US Navy sailing close to China, which has aggravated the situation. And I think that the United States should take the lead and try to, through quiet diplomacy, get China to back off and get the other states also, because since now the verdict is very clear that all those little islands and reefs, etc., do not have any maritime zone attached to them. So no one can claim any maritime zone there in any case. Not China, not Vietnam, not even the Philippines.
Okay. Atul, this point being made by Manoj about reputational damage, is it something which is a matter of serious concern for the Chinese?
Well, it is. It would be. But you see, the Chinese always counter this. They look at this kind of a binary of late, which is of China and US, the big two. And their point of view is that, the United States has been playing such an active role, at least verbally, and in fact sending their joint patrols in the South China Sea, while it is not a signatory to UNCLOS at all. So it has no moral right to pontificate on whether or not the Chinese interpretation or their views and their position is ethical or not. So, that's one argument which comes vis-a-vis the US. I just want to point out to this, that from the Chinese perspective now, it is the US now who makes the rules, international rules, whether they're of trade, whether they're of navigation, etc., etc. no longer would the U.S., what President Obama keeps insisting, that we will write the rules. The Chinese are challenging that. That is the underlying sort of objective, which will filter through whatever actions they take. That rule making is no longer the right of this hegemon after what happened after the Soviet collapse.
Okay.
That there is a multipolar world, and players like China, like Russia, and actually India have come into the party. This is the post-2008 situation, which we learned through the NSG, by the way, where Americans can't,
They can't push
the
it
power
from
has
beyond.
got diffused now, especially in the last 8 to 10 years.
Okay.
And the Chinese will question the Americans that, okay, the most important dialogue which will take place now is the dialogue between the Chinese and the Americans
Okay.
on the South China Sea and on the Asia Pacific.
Okay.
And Indians really are not part of that party. We are not in that league right now. So,
Okay.
we will, while we maintain our position, it is these big two who will play a defining role. And we
Okay.
will, of course, will be able to weave in our way through that. But we are not
Okay.
not a part of a triangle. It's a bilateral.
Mr. Sikri, interesting points being made
Well,
there.
I don't quite agree with Atul there. I think it's not just a question of the United States and China. There's a whole world involved there. And why are we ignoring the Southeast Asian countries? Because
No, but do they have the heft? That is the question.
let me just elaborate. If the Philippines is ready to compromise and share resources, what about Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia? You think everyone is going to compromise? The Chinese may have a military clout, but they are dependent on all these countries for the markets. And if they go beyond a point, they could lose these markets. They cannot assume that they will have the rest of the world as a free market which is available. You see these protectionist tendencies emerging in Europe also, where the Europeans are arguing that, you are coming in and buying our most valuable companies, but we don't have similar rights there. And when the Chinese say that what are the Americans doing in Southeast Asia as a balance, well, what are the Chinese doing in South Asia? I mean, how are the Chinese involved in South Asia? Why are they got all these facilities in South Asia? So I think that the Chinese are on a weak wicket morally, diplomatically, and politically. And I think it is understandable that they would want to project that, they have nothing to fear and nothing to lose. But I think that this is a significant blow for China, and the reputational cost for China and possibly an economic cost for China is bound to be there in the coming years if it does not
Srikanth,
act
would you agree with
responsibly.
To the extent in the Chinese, they have this face.
Everyone has face.
Yes,
Everyone
but
has face.
in the Western world, in the countries where individualism is pretty high, we don't look at those. For instance, the NSG debacle, we take it in our stride, or the UNSC, seat, not able to get those, so we take it in our stride. In the case of China, there is this phase that becomes a problematic with this verdict. So from the point of view of soft power, I think this is a problematic for China. What could be the Chinese responses? I think an extreme hardline position is to walk away from UNCLOS, which is an option the Chinese have. But again, they will lose a lot more, as Manoj has pointed out, in terms of contracts, in terms of economic and other investments profiles. And the second approach is, which is the pragmatic, as Atul mentioned. I think the Chinese are already sending signals to Filipino new president, and there is Xi Jinping had made that statement of going half the way, as he said, to the Filipino side. So I think the hard negotiations would start with the Filipinos on this.
Uday?
Very quickly, I want to say that, the suggestion made by Atul, it could be the view from China, but I don't think that would be the, shall we say, acceptable kind of interpretation, because this G2 has been going on for a long time, from President Hu Jintao's time to now. But I don't think India has ever accepted this kind of a formulation, saying that there are some basic principles that we need to acknowledge, whether you're a big power or a small power, and that is the subtext of the India-Bangladesh agreement that we arrived at. So which is why I want to go back to where I started saying China's response is going to be more critical than the text of this particular arbitration decision itself.
Okay, I think on that note we'll end, but we'll have to wait and watch for the detailed Chinese reaction, as all my panelists are pointing out, and see where that will take this whole issue to. Thanks to all my guests. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue in the big picture same time tomorrow.